Hi, everybody, and welcome back from Thanksgiving break. We're in the final week of classes, which means only two more lectures. Today's lecture, Thursday's lecture, and then the exam is next week. I just saw they have FIU has posted the final exam schedule, so the final exam for this class is exactly 1 week from today. So next Tuesday from 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock. The exam is going to work just like all the last three exams. It's non-cumulative, so you're only responsible for material since exam 3. The first half hour, just like the other exams, is going to be about 10 multiple choice questions. And then I'm going to have short answers, and you'll have an hour and a half to turn those in via Canvas. So just like the other exams. Just make a note of that it's 1 week from today, from 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock. A few more things. Remember that assignment 3 is due on Thursday at 5 o'clock. If you haven't seen that yet, it's posted in Canvas in the assignment section. Just make sure to submit that in Canvas by 5 o'clock. If you don't get it in by 5 o'clock, it's not going to accept it. So get it in by 5 o'clock, okay? Also keep in mind that the extra credit, if you want to do the essay extra credit, which again, you don't have to do if you've already done SONA studies, then you don't need to do this. But if you want to do the essay extra credit, that is also posted in the assignment section. That's also due Thursday at 5 o'clock as well. So make sure that gets submitted via Canvas as well. Remember that for each one of those papers that you submit, you can get up to 3 points of extra credit. And again, if you've already got your SONA points, then you don't need to submit any papers. Finally, I just realized today that the lecture for last class, I had posted it on Canvas and I forgot to make it public. So I made that public. So if you weren't able to access that, it is up there now. So there is a link to YouTube where you can watch that last lecture as well. One last thing before we get started is that you should have received an email, I believe, asking you to complete the Perceptions of Teaching questionnaire, basically the course evaluations. If you could complete course evaluations for this class at some point in the next week, that would be fantastic. I'd really appreciate that. I believe if you complete those, you should be able to see your final grade early. I think that's kind of a reward for you completing those course evaluations. So just make sure to complete that at some point this week, preferably, would be great. Okay, so with that being said, I just have a couple minutes. I wanted to finish talking about aggression. So let's do that before we do anything else. Okay, so if you recall, we had been talking about the Stanford prison experiment. This is a famous study that was done in the 1970s. If I showed a video at the end of last class, if you haven't seen that, go watch that YouTube video where we explain this. But just to refresh your memory, in the Stanford prison study, a researcher named Philip Zimbardo, he used college students as participants in the study, and he randomly assigned half of them to play the role of prison guards and half of them to play the role of prisoners. And he constructed this makeshift prison in the basement of Stanford University, and he allowed the guards to control this prison, basically. What he was really interested in is whether just simply telling people that they're prisoners or guards would lead those people to behave in ways that are consistent with that role. So what he was looking at was the effect of roles and how they influence our behavior. He wanted to know, if you just tell people they're a prison guard, would they come to behave aggressively towards prisoners? And if you just tell people that they're prisoners, would they come to behave like prisoners? Would they come to basically take that abuse? So there's a number of observations he made over the course of the study. Now, he originally planned on running the study for 2 weeks. It had to be canceled after 5 days because the guards' behaviors were sort of getting out of control. They were not necessarily physically abusing the prisoners because they weren't allowed to physically touch the prisoners, but they were sort of psychologically abusing them, basically. And so we see a number of behaviors on the part of the guards as a result of the study. So first off, as I mentioned, they tended to behave aggressively towards the prisoners. They were kind of using them as puppets and playing around with them. And they were making them, like, instead of being allowed to go to the bathroom, they'd have to use a bucket in their cells. They basically made prisoners wash toilets with their bare hands, things like that. They were like psychologically tormenting them, basically. And the guards tended to justify these actions by claiming that they needed to maintain order. Because after all, these guards probably think of themselves as good, ethical people, as most of us do. And yet, they were engaging in this sort of torment of these prisoners, right, of these other people. Well, that would create a lot of cognitive dissonance, right? If I believe I'm an ethical, moral person, and yet I'm doing things that are unethical or immoral. And so what happens to avoid that cognitive dissonance is that these guards start to justify their behaviors, right? Remember, one of the ways to reduce cognitive dissonance is to reduce perceived choice, to convince yourself you had to engage in those behaviors. And that's what a lot of the guards tended to do. They tended to say that they had to behave that way. They had to control the prisoner. They had to maintain order in this prison. Now, of course, they're justifying their behaviors because, of course, they're not real guards, right? They don't have to maintain order. They don't have to do any of those things because these aren't real prisoners that they're taking care of. But they're justifying their behaviors to reduce that cognitive dissonance, right? In addition, I think we see evidence of another social psychological phenomenon we've discussed earlier this semester, which is that of de-individuation. Remember that when people feel de-individuated, they sort of lose sense of their internal standards of morality, and they tend to behave oftentimes more aggressively, or at least more in line with the group that they're associating with. And so by giving all of these students identical guard uniforms, that creates a sense of anonymity. And as we've seen, that anonymity tends to increase the likelihood of de-individuation. And so these guards were likely de-individuated because of that sense of anonymity, which led them to behave in ways that are consistent with their ideas of how guards tend to behave. When we become de-individuated, we behave kind of like our expectations of how that group behaves. And so a lot of these guards tended to behave like their perceptions of how guards behave, which tends to be aggressive and controlling. But I think at least equally interesting is how the prisoners respond to the situation as well. Because again, remember, these are not real prisoners. People were just randomly assigned to play the role of prisoners or prison guards. These prisoners didn't have to follow any orders that the guards told them to do, right? They're not real prisoners. They don't have to do anything the guards told them to do. And yet, they tended to do that. They tended to feel dehumanized and isolated. Not necessarily right away, because right away, when the Stanford Prison Study occurred, there was a rebellion by the prisoners. The prisoners basically locked themselves into one of these cells, and the guards spent hours trying to get into their cell. I think they eventually were able to get in because they took like a fire extinguisher and were shooting that into the cell and basically flushed them out. But in any case, once the guards realized these prisoners were trying to challenge their authority, they wanted a revenge. And so that's when they made prisoners wash toilets with their bare hands and things like that. And what happened is that after these prisoners were punished for this rebellion, the prisoners stopped rebelling so much. In fact, they would often get mad at fellow prisoners who were trying to rebel because they didn't want to experience those punishments. It's sort of weird again, because again, these prisoners didn't have to do anything the guards told them to, and yet they went along with it. They were taking on the role of prisoners, in other words. And they had learned to become helpless. They had learned that they can't get out of their situation. I mean, they could for ethical reasons. If they wanted to say, I want to go home, the researchers would, of course, have to let them. But they had learned to become helpless. They had completely adopted this role of prisoners. And I think those prisoner responses are at least as interesting as the responses of the guards. Just to give you another example of this, at one point, the researchers held these fake parole board hearings where the prisoners would go in front of this sort of parole board and they would argue for why they should be released. Now, all the prisoners wanted to be released. They didn't really like being told what to do by the guards. And so they all argued passionately for why they should be released. And yet the parole board basically turned everyone down. At that point, the prisoners could have said, you know what, I'm done with this study. I'm just going to walk. I'm just going to leave. I'm going to go home. And yet none of them did that. Instead, what did they do? They all got disappointed and they went back to their cells. Right? It's almost like they had forgotten that they're not actual prisoners. In other words, they had adopted the roles that they had been given. And that was really the purpose of Zimbardo's study, right? In fact, in one of the great ironies of this study, Zimbardo himself in a study in which he was trying to study the effects that roles have on our behavior, adopted a role himself which affected his behavior. So here's what I mean by that. So after that rebellion, after the first day or two in the Stanford prison study, the leader of that rebellion had to be released because he was having some psychological issues. But there was a rumor that started to spread among the other prisoners and among the guards that that guy, once he was released, was going to get a bunch of his friends and they were going to come to the basement of Stanford and break people out. They're going to have like basically a prison break, right? Now, Philip Zimbardo, again, the researcher in charge of the study, heard about these rumors and he got upset. Like, how dare you break into my prison? And he went to actual police and asked them if he could use their jail cells for the night and move all of his pretend prisoners into the real jail cells so that this prison break couldn't happen. Now, what had happened, which he only realized later, what had happened is that Zimbardo himself had adopted the role of prison warden. He was now, in his mind, he was the leader of this prison, right? He was in charge of this prison. And if someone was going to try to break people out of it, he had to put a stop to it. Now, as a scientist, of course, what he should have done, he should have stood back and watched everything happen, right? Just observe things. But he got involved. So in the very study in which he was examining the effects that roles have on people's behavior, he adopted the role of prison warden, which led him to behave in line with his ideas of how prison wardens actually behave. If you look at the behaviors that people engaged in this study, what you find is that there is one big predictor of how people behaved, which was which role they had been assigned. Meaning that if people, these participants, had been assigned to play the role of prison guards, they tended to behave aggressively towards the prisoners. And if these people had been randomly assigned to play the role of prisoners, they tended to behave helplessly. The role in which people have been arbitrarily assigned greatly affected their behavior. But what's sort of interesting is that Zimbardo gave all these people like psychological assessments before the study began, and a number of other personality questionnaires and things like that. And he wanted to see if people's behaviors were also correlated with different personality variables. And what he showed is that personality didn't really predict people's behavior very much at all. What really predicted people's behavior was the social roles they were given. This is very much consistent with the basic concept of social psychology, right? Which is that the situation tends to have a large effect in determining our behavior. And in this case, the situation had a larger effect in determining people's behavior than did people's own personalities. There were, of course, ethical concerns about this study. We could never do this study today for ethical reasons. This study was done prior to the institution of IRBs, these institutional review boards that only allow researchers to run studies if they pass certain ethical requirements. They would never pass these ethical requirements today. You could not run this study today. But there were some large ethical concerns because of the way that the prisoners were being treated in this study. Interestingly enough, if you recall, when we looked at the Milgram study where people believed they were delivering electric shocks to someone, remember that when that study came out, there were a lot of ethical concerns about that study as well. Interestingly, after Zimbardo's study came out, Stanley Milgram from that study called Philip Zimbardo and thanked him for taking all the heat off of him, because now all the ethical concerns were on Zimbardo's study, not on Milgram's anymore. In any case, this is a really, really famous study in social psychology. And I think, again, part of the reason it's so famous is for the same reason that the Milgram study is so famous, which is that you take ordinary people and you place them in this situation and they behave in these extraordinary ways, right? You take people, you place them in a situation where they're told to deliver electric shocks to someone in the Milgram study. And a lot of people, the majority of people, go on and deliver these, what they believe are electric shocks, to someone else. In the Stanford prison study, you take ordinary people, you place them in a situation, you just tell them that they're prison guards and they start behaving really aggressively. Or you tell them that they're prisoners and they start behaving really helplessly. I think that a lot of the most famous studies in social psychology are famous for that very reason. Not because they show us what other people do, but because they hold a mirror up to our own behavior. That what that suggests is that if we were in these situations, we might behave the same way as well. We have the potential to engage in evil behavior if we're in the right situation. And I think that's the reason why these studies are so famous, because they make us question ourselves to some extent. Okay, That's all I wanted to say about the Stanford prison study. But we still have a quiz to do today. So let's do that, get that out of the way. So load up Top Hat right now. Okay, so this is quiz 13. Remember, there's 14 quizzes that I'm giving over the course of the semester, which means quiz 14 is going to happen on Thursday, and then I take your top 10 quizzes from there. So let's get started on quiz 13. All of these questions have to do with aggression, which we talked about last class. Question 1. Betty, an anti-war activist, is mad at the president for leading the country to war. Because she cannot go straight to the source of her frustration, she takes out her aggression on her next door neighbor Wilma instead. The situation sounds most like an example of which of the following? Is it relational aggression, instrumental aggression, desensitization, or displacement? Okay, you've got 10 seconds. Three, two, one. Okay, so we've got a situation where someone is experiencing frustration, which can lead to this motivation to aggress, but she can't take it out on the person that caused the frustration, so she takes it out on a substitute target. That should sound an awful lot like displacement, option D. Question 2. Social psychologists distinguish between two types of aggression, hostile and what? Is it relational, instrumental, physical, or vicarious? Got 10 seconds. Three, two, one. So we had differentiated between hostile aggression, which is when you commit aggression as an end in and of itself, um, and instrumental aggression is the correct answer here, where you're committing aggression in order to get something else. Question 3, which of the following was not discussed in class as a possible explanation as to why alcohol consumption is related to aggression? In other words, we discussed 3 reasons why alcohol is related to aggression. One of the following we did not discuss as a reason for why alcohol is related to aggression. Which of the following is that reason? A, alcohol increased physiological arousal, which can be misinterpreted as anger if the person is provoked. B, alcohol tends to limit the amount of information people can process, and thus they are less likely to cognitively override their aggressive impulses. C, many people think that alcohol increases aggressive behavior, and it's these expectations that lead to an increase in aggressiveness. Or D, alcohol weakens people's inhibitions, which can allow their true aggressive feelings to come out. You got 10 seconds. Three, two, one. Okay, so we discussed B, C, and D in class as reasons why alcohol can increase aggression. We did not discuss A. Now, we did talk about how if your physiological arousal levels are increased, people might misinterpret that as anger if they're provoked. However, alcohol does not increase physiological arousal. It decreases physiological arousal. And so alcohol would not cause aggression that way. All right, the last 2 questions should be easy because they're about the Stanford Prison Study, which we just discussed. So which of the following was not observed in the Stanford Prison Experiment? A, many guards came to behave aggressively towards the prisoners. B, many prisoners learned to behave helplessly in order to minimize the abuse they took from the guards. C, guards became de-individuated as a result of the uniforms that they wore. Or D, prisoners bonded with each other more than guards bonded with each other due to the increased stress of being a prisoner. Melissa or anyone else who can't submit your answers, you can always text your answers. Remember that. Feel free to text your answers if you need to. You got 10 seconds. Three, two, one. Okay, so we just discussed that the guards tended to come to behave aggressively because that was consistent with their ideas of how guards behaved. We discussed how prisoners learned to behave helplessly because, again, that was consistent with their ideas of how prisoners behaved. And we talked about how guards became de-individuated. We did not talk about D, the fact that prisoners bonded with each other more than guards bonded with each other. And last question, results from the Stanford Prison Experiment demonstrated that the biggest predictor of how aggressively participants behaved in the study was which of the following? A, the role, guard or prisoner, that they had been assigned. B, how antisocial they were before the study. C, the temperature of the room they were in. Or D, their score on the various Big Five personality factors. And you've got 10 seconds. Three, two, one. And this one should be very easy. This is the entire point of the Stanford Prison Study, which of course is A, the role they had been assigned was a big determinant in how aggressively they behaved. Okay. While you guys were taking the quiz, I was just looking at some of the chat from the beginning of the lecture, and I just saw a few questions I'm going to address quickly. For the exam next week, it's just like all the other exams, so we're going to meet on Zoom. I think as of right now, I don't think I have a Zoom meeting scheduled. I will create a Zoom meeting in Canvas, okay? So there will be one for Tuesday. So just go into that Zoom meeting, just like you normally would for a regular class. Yes, you can use your notes during the short answers, just like the other exams. You shouldn't have a final. I think most people shouldn't have a final on the same day at the same time because the schedule is created to try to not have that happen. But in some situations that can occur. If that's the case, you're going to have to move one of those exams. I could always give you the makeup exam early. If you want to do that, let me know and I can give it to you on like Monday or something like that. But that shouldn't be an issue, I would hope, for most people. Okay. Okay, so we are discussing a new topic. This is the final topic that we're going to be discussing this semester. And before I get into the psychology of it, I just have a few stories that I want to share with you. This first one concerns a woman by the name of Dalitha Word. She was a 33-year-old woman back in, I think this was 1995. So we're looking at 25 years ago. And she was driving in Detroit. This is about 2 a.m. or so. She was crossing a bridge in Detroit when she got into a minor fender bender. She basically rear-ended the person in front of her. Nothing too serious, just kind of a minor fender bender. The person she rear-ended, his name was Martel Welch Jr. Now, Martel Welch Jr. is a big guy. He was like 270 pounds. He was like 6'6" or something like that. Just like a big, intimidating guy. Dalitha Word, on the other hand, is about 100 pounds soaking wet. Like she is a really, really small woman. She's barely 5 feet tall. Okay. Now, despite the fact that this was a pretty minor fender bender, Martel Welch Jr. was furious. And he got out of his car and he went to Dalitha Word's car and he started yelling at her. And he basically forced her car door open and he grabbed her and he ripped her out of the car. And in the process of ripping her out of the car, tore off some of her clothes. While berating her and yelling at her, he took her head and smashed it into the hood of her own car a few times. And he kept yelling and screaming about how he wanted to kill her. At one point, he goes back to his car, opens up the trunk and takes a tire iron and starts advancing to Dalitha Word and starts hitting her car with the tire iron and then telling her he's going to beat her to death with it. Now, Dalitha Word is, of course, terrified. And she decides that she'd be better off if she takes her chances instead of with Martel Welch Jr., if she takes her chances by jumping off the bridge into the waters below, which she does. Now, this is in the wintertime in Detroit, so it's pretty cold, right? These waters are really cold. And she's at risk of hypothermia and drowning, right? And so she's struggling in the water a little bit. And then 2 men come across the scene and they see her struggling in the water. And they immediately jump in after her to try to rescue her. Now, at this point, Dalitha Word has been beaten. She has jumped off a bridge into freezing cold waters. She's probably barely conscious at this point. It's likely she thinks that these 2 men who are trying to rescue her are in fact trying to come after her. So she tries to get away from them as well. And as she does so, she slips under the water and drowns. Now, that was a particularly shocking story, of course, but what is even more shocking is that over the course of this attack, which lasted between 10 and 25 minutes, no fewer than about 40 people watched it happen during this time, which prompted Dalitha Word's mother to say, I can't believe all those people just stood around and watched. In fact, the two people who jumped in the water to try to rescue Delete the Word were not on the scene when this accident originally happened. They only came across the scene. They only came across the bridge after she had jumped off the bridge, and then they jumped in after her. But of the other 40 or so people who were watching, none of them did anything to help Delete the Word. This is Kitty Genovese. Kitty Genovese was a 28-year-old New Yorker. She was a bar manager back in 1968, I believe it was. And after a shift, she was coming home. It was around 3:20 in the morning. And she pulled up.
She almost like died or whatever. So he goes to get a crowbar in his car to kill her because he was so mad. And she decides to just jump in a bridge. And
is someone teaching along with me right now? I'm just going to mute your mics. Hold on. There we go. Okay.
Winter in Detroit. So she like goes in the water, and then two people jump in to rescue her. And like she gets scared.
Is someone talking right now?
Kill her too, and she ends up drowning.
Okay, for some reason I'm unable to mute. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay. Okay, so Kitty Genovese was coming home after a shift, and she was walking to her apartment building, and it's really dark, of course, in the parking lot because it's about 3:20 in the morning. And she notices some guy kind of standing underneath a tree. And as she's walking to her apartment building, he starts following her. And she gets a little concerned at this point, so she starts walking a little faster. And then she hears the footsteps behind her get faster and faster. And she starts running. And there's like a kind of a phone booth where you can call for emergency services. And she starts heading towards that. And as she's running towards that, she hears the footsteps start to run behind her. And the man who's behind her catches up, and he grabs her and he lifts her up and he takes out a knife and he stabs her. And she screams out at that point. And someone in the apartment building she's trying to get to, in a window up above, opens a window and says, hey, leave that woman alone. And the man drops her and takes off. And Kitty Genovese is still alive. She has not been killed. She's still alive, but she's pretty badly injured. Right? And so she starts crawling towards her apartment complex, and she opens the front doors and she collapses into the lobby inside. The man who attacked her, though, had set out that night to find a victim to attack. And his plan was to kill someone that night, and he has not accomplished that plan yet. And so he comes back 10 minutes later, and he starts hunting for Kitty Genovese. And he sees a trail of blood that she's left in the parking lot. And he follows that trail of blood to the front doors. And he opens the front doors, and he finds her inside, basically semi-conscious, almost passed out, and bleeding profusely. And when he gets into that lobby, he takes her wallet and steals $49, and he rapes her, and he leaves. And the whole attack takes approximately 35 or 40 minutes. Now, about 2 minutes after he leaves, the first call to 911 is made, and the authorities are there within minutes. And Kitty Genovese is still alive, and they load her up in the ambulance. They take her to the hospital, but she dies on the way to the hospital. Now, when the investigators start investigating this crime, what they discover, shockingly, is that no fewer than 38 people saw or heard some part of that attack. Now, in some stories, people claim that 38 people watched the attack. That's not entirely true. As far as I know, no one saw the entire attack, but 38 people saw or heard some part of that attack. And yet, the first call did not go into 911 until about 2 minutes after her attacker left. Now, how can we explain such blatant inaction on the part of these bystanders? When the story broke, of course, people all over the place were saying that this is just indicative of the fact that we just don't care about each other anymore, that we're apathetic to the suffering of others. But some social psychologists were thinking that maybe that's not entirely true. That sounds an awful lot like the fundamental attribution error, attributing other people's behavior, or in this case, inaction, or lack of behavior, to their personality, right? And they thought maybe there were some situational variables at play that might have resulted in the inaction of these people. And they created basically a flowchart, a theory, a social psychological theory that describes when people will or will not provide help that we're going to talk about later on. But again, we see this tendency where you've got dozens of people who seem to do nothing to help someone who's in obvious need. January 13th, 1982, Air Florida Flight 90 takes off from Washington, D.C. in the middle of a snowstorm. And the snowstorm is so bad that the pilots lose control of the plane within minutes of taking off. And the plane crashes into the Potomac River. Now, this is January in DC, so these waters are freezing. And although most people are killed initially when the plane crashes, there are a handful of survivors. And these survivors have congregated around the only part of the plane that's sticking out of the water, which is the tail section of the plane. So you can imagine these survivors, these few people who have been lucky enough to survive this plane crash, are at serious risk of dying of either drowning or of hypothermia very, very quickly. So the authorities send for helicopters to try to rescue these people. And the first helicopter gets there, and it has kind of like this rope ladder, and it drops this rope ladder into the people who are surrounding the tail of this plane. And a lot of people are barely hanging on here, but there's one guy who's particularly conscious, so he grabs the rope ladder. But instead of taking it for himself, he gives it to another passenger. And that other passenger grabs onto the rope ladder, and then the helicopter basically is dragging this person at the end of that rope ladder, drags that person to the bank, drops them off, comes back to the tail section. And again, that rope ladder is dangling there. And again, the same guy takes that rope ladder, and again, instead of taking it for himself, he gives it to someone else. And every time the helicopter rescues someone and takes them and drops them off at the bank, at the shores, and comes back, the same guy grabs it, gives it to someone else, and that person's rescued. And over, that's what this helicopter is doing. And finally, when there's no one left to be rescued, the helicopter comes back. Or actually, before I get there, let me tell you one other thing. One of the people who is handed this rope ladder, her name is Priscilla Tirado, and she grabs onto the rope ladder. Now, her husband and her newborn baby have both died in this plane crash. And she is on the verge of dying of hypothermia. And as she's holding onto this rope ladder, as the helicopter's dragging her to shore, she doesn't have the strength to hold on anymore. And she lets go and she falls into the water. And now there's no tail section. There's no other passengers around her. So she is about to drown. Now, while this is all happening, there's a bunch of spectators that line up on the bank of the Potomac River. And one of the guys who's lined up on the bank of the river, his name is Lenny Skutnik, and he sees Priscilla Tirado fall from this rope ladder into the waters below. And he takes off his jacket and his shoes and he jumps in the freezing waters, risking his own life to save the life of a woman he's never met before. And he does. He actually saves her life that day. Meanwhile, the helicopter's going back and forth until finally, all of the passengers that this guy has given the rope ladder to have all been saved. And the helicopter goes back one last time to save this guy. And they drop the rope ladder and he's nowhere to be found. In fact, thanks to his heroism, he is the only person who survived the plane crash to have then died. Everyone else was saved, thanks to him. And for a while, it was not known who this person was. He was known as the unknown hero. It was later found out that his name was Arlen D. Williams. In fact, I believe there's a street in Washington, D.C. named Arlen D. Williams Street, named after him today for his heroism. But if you contrast this story and the incredible acts of heroism from Lenny Skutnik, from Arlen D. Williams, and you contrast that with the Kitty Genovese story or the Dalitha Word story, where 40-ish people observed people being attacked and ultimately killed, and yet no one did anything. How do we explain the differences in these outcomes between these two stories? We're going to look into that later on. In 1996, in the Chicago Zoo, a 3-year-old boy climbed over the barrier that separates the people who are at the zoo from the gorilla enclosure. He climbs over the barrier and falls over into the gorilla enclosure. He falls, I think it's like 20 feet, knocking his head on the concrete, which knocks him out unconscious immediately. And as if that isn't horrifying enough, the onlookers are even more horrified when they see the gorillas start to approach this little boy, who's completely defenseless at this point. Now, the first gorilla that gets to this boy, her name is Binti. This is a picture that was taken of Binti, who instead of tearing this boy limb from limb, instead picked him up and cradled him in her arms, as you're seeing her do right now. She then took his body to the gates where the zookeepers come in to feed the gorillas and clean the enclosure. She takes his body to the gates and she lays it down in front of the gates. She then backs off, and when other gorillas come close, she growls at them to keep their distance. As a consequence, the zookeepers are able to get to this boy and they're able to save his life. Now, when this happened, Binti was hailed as a hero. She was all over the news. In fact, I believe, I think Time Magazine named Binti Person of the Year, actually, which is weird because she's not a person, but close enough. This is incredible, right? I mean, we're seeing seemingly this amazing altruism, this empathy in a non-human, in a gorilla for a human, this cross-species altruism. But it wasn't long before a different story started to emerge. There's a little more to the story than meets the eye, because it turns out that when Binti was younger, she had been abandoned by her own mother. And as a consequence, Binti didn't really know how to care for her own offspring. So in the months and years leading up to this incident, what the zookeepers had been doing is training Binti of how to take care of her own offspring. And specifically, what they had done is they had given Binti a little doll. And they had trained Binti to cradle this doll in her arms. And they had trained Binti that if anything's ever wrong with the doll, to take the doll, to place it in front of the gates where the zookeepers come in, and to back off so the zookeepers can get access to it. And so the obvious question that arises is this: was Binti's behaviors that day, were those behaviors the result of empathy and altruism for this little boy? Or was Binti simply acting out a series of learned behaviors that she had learned in the months prior to this incident? And in fact, she experienced no altruism or empathy for this boy at all. Now, I'm not going to be able to answer this question because I do not know the answer to this question. However, it raises a number of questions about the ability of non-humans, for instance, to experience empathy for humans. And maybe more generally, it raises questions about whether any behavior can truly be considered altruistic. Because what we have here is a situation that seems altruistic on its surface, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe she was just acting out a series of behaviors. And similarly, what we're going to see later in this section is that there's a debate that surrounds the question of whether anyone ever truly acts truly altruistically, or whether every single behavior we engage in is actually aimed at improving ourselves in some way. For instance, if we help others, we feel pretty good in doing so, right? And feeling good is a benefit to ourselves. So is it the case that we can truly ever actually behave in an altruistic manner, or is every behavior we engage in ultimately aimed at increasing our own well-being? That's a question that we're going to look at later on. But before we get there, or actually, I guess I'm going to introduce this topic right now to some extent. And I'm going to introduce it in terms of social exchange theory, which is a theory we've seen before in this class. When we looked at attraction, we looked at social exchange theory as a theory that explains when people will or will not leave relationships. And if you recall, at the time I said that social exchange theory is broader than that. It can be applied to a whole bunch of behaviors, including altruism and helping behavior. And so the basics of social exchange theory is this. According to social exchange theory, people want to maximize our own rewards and minimize our own costs. So we saw that when we looked at relationships, that when deciding whether to stay in a relationship or leave a relationship, people will try to maximize their benefits and minimize their costs. The same principle applies for decisions such as whether to help someone. So in other words, according to social exchange theory, people will help others only if their perceived rewards outweigh the costs of helping that person. And there certainly are a lot of rewards for helping people, right? As I mentioned, you feel good after helping someone, right? That good feeling is a reward that you get for helping. But also, not only do we feel good ourselves, but we can get social approval. Other people like it when we behave in an altruistic manner, and we like when other people like us. So social approval is a benefit we get. Or maybe you want to volunteer at a hospital but you're partly doing it because you want to boost your CV, right? You want to help your job prospects later on. So these are all sorts of rewards that we can get for helping someone else. But helping also comes with certain costs as well. For instance, if you think about the delete the word case, where people might be watching this guy beat delete the word with a tire iron, well, there's a lot of potential harm if you try to get involved. If you try to stop and intervene, you might get beaten as well, right? So there's potential harm that's involved with providing help as well. Or there's even potential embarrassment. If you are on South Beach and on the beach itself, and you see someone passed out, you go to give CPR, mouth to mouth, and they're just sunbathing, that's pretty embarrassing to you, right? So there's potential embarrassment involved with providing help to someone. Volunteering at a hospital might be good on your CV, but it's also very time consuming, which means you can't be spending time doing things that you might otherwise like to do. Or maybe you're downtown and someone asks you, a homeless person asks you for money, and maybe you give them $1, not because you're necessarily concerned about their well-being, but because you know that you're going to feel guilty for the next 20 minutes if you don't give them $1. So to avoid that feeling of guilt, you help that person. So you can see there's a whole bunch of rewards and costs that are associated with any decision of whether to help or not. And so a social exchange theorist simply says that we will help if the rewards outweigh the benefits. Sorry, if the rewards outweigh the costs. In other words, it's not that people won't help. They, of course, will help, but they'll only help for egoistic reasons. The reason for why they're helping, the motivating force for why they're helping, is because it satisfies some internal need. It makes them feel good in some way. There's some benefit to people. That's one perspective. Now, I should say not everybody, not all social psychologists subscribe to this perspective. This is a perspective that some people subscribe to. But there's a second perspective that some people have as well. Some other researchers believe that, in fact, there is such a thing as true altruism. A social exchange theorist doesn't think so, right? That everything is egoistic at some level. But according to what's known as the empathy altruism hypothesis, these researchers believe that true altruism can exist. It doesn't always exist. Certainly social exchange theory is true to some degree, but what they would argue is that under some specific circumstances, we will help others for truly altruistic reasons. So they don't think all helping is self-serving. They would acknowledge that some helping certainly is self-serving, but not all of it. In particular, what subscribers to the empathy altruism hypothesis believe is that truly altruistic helping, in other words, helping when there's no benefit to ourselves, will occur when we experience empathy. And that's the key. Now, empathy refers to the ability to put yourself into someone else's shoes. And so what that means is that if you can empathize with someone, if you can see the world through their eyes or put yourself in their shoes, if you can do that, then you will help them for altruistic reasons. So here's another way to think about this. So what this means is that if you observe someone in need of help, the question that will dictate the reasons for why you might or might not help them is the following. Do you feel empathy for this person? If you don't feel empathy for the person, it's not that you're not going to help. You still might help, but only if the rewards outweigh the costs. In other words, this is social exchange theory, right? This is when you have the egoistic motive for helping. And even a social exchange theorist says that that will happen if you don't feel empathy for someone. On the other hand, if you do feel empathy for someone, then according to social exchange theory, you're going to help them regardless of the rewards and costs. You're not going to try to figure out if you benefit from it. You're just going to help them regardless to reduce their suffering. So, how do these researchers test this idea? Well, here's what they do. Here's a classic study that they conducted to test this idea. So imagine you're a participant in this study. So you show up to this lab and you're told that there's really two participants that are coming. There's another person. The other person who's coming, her name is Elaine. She's not here yet. So while you're waiting for Elaine, the researcher places you in an individual room. And in this room, there's a TV screen, a monitor that's hooked up to a video camera that's in an adjacent room. Now, there's nobody in that adjacent room yet, but that's where Elaine is going to be. That's what the researcher tells you. So right now, there's no one there. And while you're waiting for Elaine to show up, the researcher gives you some information about Elaine. In particular, what the research tells you is that a little while ago, Elaine filled out a bunch of questionnaires. And so in order to get to know Elaine, because you're going to be working with her in the future task, in order to get to know her, he's going to show you her responses to some of these questions. Now, what's actually happening is that at this point, the researcher is manipulating whether you're going to feel empathy for Elaine or not. Because what we now know is that we are much more likely to feel empathy for someone if we feel like that person is very similar to us. In other words, it's a lot easier to put yourself into someone else's shoes if they're just like you, right? So what the researchers have actually done is they're giving you questionnaires that they're telling you came from Elaine, but in fact, they filled them out themselves to either be very similar to how you filled out those questions when you filled them out a while ago, or to be very different from you. Okay? So it's just a manipulation of how similar Elaine supposedly is to you. Finally, when Elaine gets there, you see on the monitor, you see Elaine being placed into the adjacent room. And the researcher tells you what's happening. The researcher says the following, that what's going to happen is that in this study, one person receives a series of electric shocks, and the other person simply observes that person receiving electric shocks. And because Elaine was the last one here, she's the one that's going to be getting these electric shocks. So you don't have to do anything other than just simply observe her. So you just watch her on this monitor. Okay. Now, as this study takes place, and as you watch Elaine receive these electric shocks, it's pretty obvious that she's getting really uncomfortable. She's really not enjoying the study, right? And it's clear to the researcher as well, because after a few shocks, you can see the researcher go into a room, again, watching it on the monitor, and the researcher says, look, I can see you're really uncomfortable. I think we should stop this study. And Elaine says, you know what? I'm really uncomfortable. I've had some bad experiences with electricity, so that's why I'm acting this way. But you know what? I think the study is really important. I really want to proceed. I really want to finish the study now that I've started it. And the researcher says, oh, I just don't know if we can go ahead with this right now. Then he says, okay, wait a second. I have an idea. And he leaves Elaine's room and he comes into your room. And he says the following. You've been watching what's been happening here. You've been seeing Elaine receive these shocks. You can tell she's really uncomfortable. She wants to stop, or I want to stop the study. She wants to keep going. I have a solution. You don't have to do this. It's totally up to you. But one solution could be, well, if you want to switch places with Elaine, you can receive the rest of the electric shocks and Elaine can watch you. Now, again, you don't have to do this, but it's an option that you have. And at this point, the researcher randomly assigns you to one of two conditions as well. In one condition, he says, if you don't want to switch places with Elaine, that's totally fine. And we already have the data we need from you. We've already observed her receive these few shocks. You don't need to stay around. We'll just keep shocking her, but you can leave. You don't have to be in the study anymore. Okay, that's going to be the easy to leave condition. And the other condition, the researcher says, if you don't want to switch places with Elaine, that's totally fine. But you'll still have to watch her receive the rest of her electric shocks. Okay, that's the difficult to leave or difficult escape condition. Now, what the researchers really want to know is, would these participants help Elaine by offering to switch places with her? Okay, now I'm going to walk you through the study so you can see the logic behind the study and how it provides a test of the empathy altruism hypothesis. Okay. So we're going to start in the high empathy condition. Okay, so this is the condition where you are led to believe that Elaine is just like you. And because she's just like you, that should foster a sense of empathy. And according to these researchers, if you experience empathy for Elaine, you should help her regardless of the rewards and costs to yourself. Okay? In other words, you shouldn't take into consideration whether you can leave or not leave. It doesn't really matter. You're going to help her regardless, right? And so what they show is that people are very likely to help Elaine regardless of how easy it is to leave the situation themselves. Okay. Okay, now the next condition is the critical condition. Because in this condition, people are led to believe, you are led to believe that Elaine is very dissimilar to you. She's not like you at all. She's very different from you. As a consequence, you don't experience empathy for Elaine. So what happens? Okay, well, in the low empathy condition, easy escape condition, okay, that's this blue bar here, very few people help Elaine. After all, they don't feel empathy for her, so you don't feel a need to help her. So we're only going to help if the rewards outweigh the costs, and there's a lot of cost to helping Elaine because you're going to receive electric shocks, right? And there's not very many costs with not helping her because you're allowed to just simply leave the study and you never have to think about her again. So people tend not to help. But now in the condition in which it's a difficult situation to escape, meaning that if you decide not to help Elaine, you've got to take her place, or sorry, you have to watch her receive the rest of her shocks. Okay? Well, now the participants are thinking, well, I don't really feel empathy, so I don't really want to help her for that reason. But if I don't help her, I'm going to feel so guilty watching her receive the rest of the shocks. Like, I know I should have switched places. I'm going to feel so incredibly guilty for the next 20 minutes in the study. You know what? I have to switch places with her because I don't want to feel that guilt. So what happens is that these people switch places with her, and they offer to be shocked themselves, not because they care about her well-being, but because they want to avoid the guilt associated with not switching places with her. So this helping here is helping for egoistic reasons, not for altruistic reasons. How do we know that? Because if they were in a situation where they can simply walk out of the study and they wouldn't have to watch Elaine receive any more shocks, this easy escape condition, that's exactly what they do. If they were truly invested in Elaine's well-being and they really wanted to help her because they were concerned about her, they'd help her regardless of how easy it was for them to leave the study, just like the people in the high empathy condition did. But they're only helping her because they don't want to feel guilty if they say no. Okay? So that's what this study is showing, is that when people have high empathy for someone else, they help regardless of the rewards and costs, regardless of how easy it is to escape the situation. If people don't feel empathy for someone, they will only help if the rewards outweigh the costs. So they're helping in this difficult escape condition to avoid feeling guilty. But if they can just escape the situation entirely, that's what they'll do. They won't help at all. Okay? So these researchers who believe in the empathy altruism hypothesis, they show this study as evidence that people will help others for altruistic reasons if and only if they experience empathy for that person. Now, social exchange theorists respond to this study in different ways. They interpret the study very, very differently. I'm not going to get into the whole debate back and forth between the two, but just know that they have a different interpretation of these data. Okay. So that debate rages on as to whether there really exists such a thing as true altruism. That's what the empathy altruism researchers would say, or whether all behavior is a result of egoistic motives. That's what social exchange theorists would say. It's a very, very difficult question to actually reconcile one way or the other. Okay, what I want to do though is talk about some situational influences that affect our likelihood of providing help to other people. And one of these situational influences that has been looked at is the influence of time pressure. And this forms what I consider to be maybe the most ironic study in all of social psychology. Now, the reason for that will become obvious in a second. This study was conducted with theology students. So these are students who are training to become like priests and pastors and that sort of thing. And they're told when they get to the study that what they're going to be doing is to be giving an impromptu lecture on the Good Samaritan parable from the Bible. Now, in the Good Samaritan parable, there's a man who's in need of help at the side of the road, who's been injured apparently at the side of the road. And a priest who's kind of a high status figure sees this person, just walks by and doesn't provide help. And then another, I think like a Levite, another high status person, I believe, sees this person, doesn't provide help. And the third person to come along is a Samaritan. And at the time, Samaritans were looked down upon. It was kind of a low status person. But it's the Samaritan who actually provides help for this person. So these theology students are told that they're going to have to give this improvised lecture on this Good Samaritan parable. And they're told one of two things. So they're randomly assigned to be told either that they're early to give this talk. So the talk's in half an hour. It's on the other side of campus, but you have plenty of time to get there. Or they're told that they're late to give this talk. You know what? You got to get to the other side of campus immediately to give this talk. So everybody, all these participants make their way across campus to give this impromptu talk. Okay. On their way to give this talk, they come across this man who's slumped, kind of like the guy in the Good Samaritan parable. There's a guy that's like seemingly in need of help, who's seemingly injured and is kind of coughing and groaning. They come in contact with him because he's like leaning against the building that they're going to give this talk to. And what the researchers want to know, because this is someone who is just acting this role, what the researchers want to know is, will these theology students provide help to this person? And will their likelihood of providing help depend on whether they're late or early to give this talk? So what they showed is the following, that among these people who believe that they were early to give this talk, then almost 2/3 of them helped, about 63% of them provided help to this man. If, on the other hand, they believe that they were late to give this talk, that number drops dramatically to only 10%. The vast majority of people did not provide help to this man if they believed they were late to give a talk. Okay? So our likelihood of providing help, in other words, depends on how much time pressure we are otherwise under. And so I said this was maybe the most ironic study in all of social psychology. And the reason why is this. You have to imagine yourself in the minds of these theology students. So you're one of these people and you're thinking, okay, I'm going to go over to this building. I'm going to give a talk about how we should always, it's really important to provide help. We always need to provide help, okay? We always need to provide help. We always need to provide help. Hey, there's a man who needs help. We always need to provide help. And they just continue on, right? So on their way to give a talk about how we should always provide help, they don't provide help to the man who actually needs it. In fact, they did some follow-up studies where what they did is these students who were giving this talk, when they encountered this man, the man was lying across the doorway. So what they had to do is, in order to give their talk, they literally had to step over this guy who needs help. And that's what they tended to do if they thought they were late to give a talk. They stepped over the man who needed help so that they can give a talk on why we should always give help to people who need it. So time pressure affects our likelihood of providing help. Another factor that affects our likelihood of providing help is the mood we happen to be in when we encounter someone who needs help. So for instance, we're more likely to provide help if we're in a happy mood. I'll give you a couple sample studies that showed this. One study, very basic study, what researchers did is they approached people in a shopping mall, either in front of a sports store or in front of a bakery. And they asked them to provide change for $1. And so the likelihood that people would provide change for $1, that's their outcome measure, that's their measure of helping. And what they showed is people are more likely to give change for $1 if they were asked to do so in front of a bakery rather than if they were asked to do so in front of a clothing store, sports store. Why is that the case? Well, because the smell of that comes from a bakery is really pleasant and really good, right? It puts us in a happy mood. When we're in a happy mood, we're much more likely to help others because helping others helps us maintain that happy mood, basically. In the second study, what researchers did, this was decades ago, back when there were like payphones. And the payphones, they cost $0.10 at the time. And what the researchers did is they rigged some of these payphones to randomly give people back their dime once they had finished making the phone call. And so people randomly assigned to either get their dime back or not. And then when they walked away from their phone booth, there's a woman there with a bunch of folders. And as she's walking, she accidentally drops her folders in front of the unwitting participant. What the researchers want to know is, would these people help this woman pick up her files? And what they showed is that if people had just gotten their dime back, they were drastically more likely to help this woman than if they had not gotten their dime back. Presumably because getting their dime back led these people to feel happier. Hey, I got a phone call for free. That put them in a good mood, which made them more likely to help this woman. Okay? Something as stupid and inconsequential as getting 10 cents back, in other words, drastically increase people's likelihood of helping. But it's not just happiness as a mood that increases our likelihood of helping, because a feeling of guilt can also increase our likelihood of helping. So let me tell you about a couple studies here. So in one study, researchers asked people for, I think it was donation to charity, and they asked people who were either going into church to give confession or who were coming out of church just after having given confession. Now, the idea is that people going into church before they confess their sins should tend to feel guilty. And if guilt increases their likelihood of helping, then people going into confession should be more likely to help than people coming out of confession who feel like their sins have been absolved. And that's exactly what they found. People are more willing to help on their way into confession rather than coming out of confession because they felt guilty because their sins were still weighing on them. In the second study, what researchers did is they went to a shopping mall and they randomly stopped people in a shopping mall. And they said something like the following. They said, excuse me, would you be willing to help me? I just bought a camera. I just want to test it out just to make sure everything's working. If you could do me a favor here, if you could just take a picture of me, I'd greatly appreciate it. And so if you're a participant, you take the camera and you line them up. And at that point, you're randomly assigned to one of two conditions. In one condition, you take a picture, everything's fine. In the second critical condition, you go to take the picture and nothing happens. And you try again and nothing happens. And the guy says, wait a second, what did you just, I literally bought that 10 minutes ago. Did you break my camera? I think you just broke my camera. I cannot believe this. I mean, thanks anyway, and walks off. So at this point, these people are feeling kind of guilty, right? So this person, Lee, starts walking down through the rest of the mall, and there's a woman with folders, and she drops her folders in front of these participants. And again, what the researchers want to know is, will people help this woman pick up her folders? And is their likelihood of helping dependent on whether they believe they just broke someone else's camera? And it was. People were much more likely to help her if they believed they had just broken some other person's camera, because they felt guilty for breaking that person's camera. One way to get rid of our guilt is to help someone else, even if the person we're helping isn't the person that we wronged in the first place. Right? But just as a means of getting rid of our guilt, that increases our likelihood of helping. There's a few other situational factors that influence our likelihood of providing help as well. One of these factors is attractiveness, meaning people tend to be more likely to help people they find physically attractive than people they don't find physically attractive. So in one study that looked at this, what they did is researchers put together a bunch of application packages for graduate school, basically. These were just like fictitious people who were applying for graduate school. And what they did is they left these packages at places around the city, like coffee shops and phone booths and airports and things like that. Now, what they did is they had an application package with like a CV and a bunch of other things. And they had the person who's apparently applying, had their photograph on it. And they had it on an envelope that was addressed and stamped. So if you come across this, all you'd have to do is drop the application into the package, drop it in the mailbox. Okay, so if you wanted to help them, that's all you had to do. Now, what the researchers did is they manipulated the photo that was attached to this application. So for half of these applications, the photo was of a pretty attractive person. And for the other half of the applications, it was of a much less attractive person. Other than that, everything was identical. Now, what the researchers did is they had addressed that application package to themselves. So after a couple weeks, you could simply count up how many applications you received in the mail. And what they showed is that people were much more likely to help this applicant by mailing in their application package if the photo was of a relatively attractive person compared to if it was of a less attractive person. So in other words, people are simply more likely to help people that they find physically attractive, which is rather unfortunate. We are also more likely to help people that we find similar to ourselves. Now, we've seen how similarity matters in a lot of other respects. So we saw that within persuasion, for instance, or compliance. We saw that similarity matters. We're more likely to comply with people who are similar to us. And a similar principle holds as well for helping, that we're more likely to help people who are similar to us as well. And some research studies have shown us that if people are dressed similarly to you, you're more likely to help them than if they're dressed in a different manner because they're more similar to you. There's a number of reasons for why this is the case. One of them relates to the empathy altruism hypothesis. So in the study that we talked about a few minutes ago with Elaine, remember that the manipulation of empathy that was used in that study was really a manipulation of similarity, right? Meaning that if you believed that Elaine was very similar to you, that tended to invoke a sense of empathy for Elaine. And so that's partly what's happening here, is that when people are similar to us and in need of help, that invokes a sense of empathy for that person, which makes us more likely to help them. That's not the only reason similarity matters, but it's one of the reasons. It might seem obvious that we're more likely to help our friends than we are to help strangers. However, that's not always entirely true. Under many situations, it is true that we are more likely to help our friends than we are to help strangers. But there are some situations in which that's not true. In particular, it depends on ego relevance. Here's what I mean by that. Let's say that you consider yourself to be a really good guitar player. Let's say that's a really critical component of your self-concept. It's foundational. You are the guitar player in your community of friends, right? Well, if a stranger outperforms you at guitar, that's not a big deal because of course there's always going to be someone who's better at guitar than you are. But if a friend of yours does better at guitar than you do, that really hurts, man, because that's part of your self-concept, right? Now your friend's doing better at you than the very thing that you consider to be integral to your self-concept. We don't really like it, in other words, when our friends do better than us on tasks that are important to us. Another example, if you consider yourself to be very invested in academics and doing well in school, and you don't get into your top graduate programs, but your friend gets into their top graduate programs, we really hate that, right? We really hate when our friends outperform us on something that's really important to us. As a consequence, what some studies have shown is that we're more likely to help strangers than we are to help our friends when the task is one that's relevant to our own ego. So if playing guitar is really important to me, then I do not want to help my friends play guitar really well because that might mean they're better than me and that's really going to hurt me. But I don't have a problem helping a stranger play guitar. So some studies even show that people will sabotage their friend's performance on tasks that are relevant to themselves in order to avoid that uncomfortable feeling when our friends outperform us in something that is important to us. Now, we like it when our friends perform well on other things. So if our friend's a really good violin player and I don't play violin, that's great. We love it. We like to associate with successful other people. We saw that before in this class when we talked about basking in reflected glory. So this only applies to situations in which the task is relevant to our own ego. Then we don't like our friends to succeed because it hurts us. It hurts our ego. But maybe the most commonly studied factor, situational factor, that influences our likelihood of helping is the number of bystanders that are present in a given situation. If we think back to the stories at the beginning of this class that I mentioned, we've got the Kitty Genovese story in which 38 people saw or heard some part of the attack and no one did anything for like 40 minutes. And we saw the Dalitha Word case where 40 people witnessed an attack over the course of at least 10 minutes and up to 25 minutes. They witnessed this attack and did nothing to help. This seems strange to us, right? Because we might assume that the more people, the more bystanders that are present, the more likely we are to get help. But what some researchers reasoned after hearing about the Kitty Genovese case, what they thought is that maybe this intuition is incorrect. They thought that maybe what's happening is that the larger the crowd, the more bystanders that are present, the less likely anyone is to get help. Sort of counterintuitive. In other words, what they would say is that if you were in need of help, if you were going to have a heart attack and you were in need of help, it is better, you are more likely to get help if there's only one other person there than if there's 40 other people there. And that led these two researchers, Darley and Latine are their last names, that led them to conduct a series of highly influential studies on the effects that bystanders have on our likelihood of providing help. And that is where we are going to pick up next class. Okay, so just to refresh your memory one more time, assignment 3 is due 5 o'clock on Thursday. Make sure to get that in. The extra credit papers, if you choose to do those, are due Thursday at 3, or sorry, Thursday at 5. So make sure you get those in by 5 o'clock as well. And then exam 4 is a week from today from 5 to 7. I will create a Zoom link. I'll get that into Canvas. Just join class like you normally would. Okay? And one person has a question about SONAs. Yeah, so for the extra credit, remember, you can get 8 points of extra credit in this class. For every point you get in SONA, I double it. So if you have 4 points in SONA and you apply them to this class, I double that, so you get 8 points in the class, and there's no point doing any papers for that reason. If you don't do SONA, you can submit papers, and you can submit up to 3 papers to get up to those 8 points. Okay? Okay, and yes, exam 4 is the final. That is correct. Okay, one last thing. Make sure if you're doing extra credit via Sona, make sure that you input this class into Sona. If you don't input SOP 3004 UO2 with me, I will not be able to see your extra credits. So you have to make sure that you're signed up for this class and make sure it's the right section. Some people do that. They sign up for the wrong section. Make sure you're signed up for the section with me and make sure you assign your points to this class. That will give me the ability to see them and then calculate your extra credit that way. Okay? All right, guys. Thanks a lot. And I'll see you guys on Thursday. Have a good one.